Intimate partner violence is complicated, it's ugly, and it happens to people we love. And that's exactly why we need to talk about it. And it's what we'll do today on part 1 in this conversation with guest Sarah Ludwig. This episode contains discussions of sexual, physical, and psychological violence. If this is something you are currently navigating or healing from, please give yourself permission to sit this one out. It is okay to pause, skip, or come back to this episode when you're ready. If you need support, reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 or text START, START, to 88788. You can also chat at thehotline.org. They're available 24/7. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Motivation and That, where we take hot mess to high potential. I'm Natalie, your host, and today I am joined by Sarah Ludwig, who's going to tell you all about herself in a second because I cannot do her resume or her experience justice. But know that today's topic is probably going to be one that's a little tough for some folks if it resonates with your experiences or what you've been through. So just want to make sure we double up that warning. I know you probably heard one on the intro leading into this, but today we are talking about domestic violence and sexual violence and the impact on victims and their villages and things like that. So if you find this triggering at any point, we do want to make sure to encourage you to please look out for you and yourself during this process. Or, if you're, bringing up things about people that you love or anything like that, take your time, hit pause, take that deep breath that you might need. Do know we're going to have lots of resources kind of linked, mentioned throughout today's episode, and we very well may end up in a two-parter. There is just so much here to unpack that I think, Sarah, when you and I had our prep call, we were like 40 minutes in and we're like, oh, this is just the prep. So this is something I know, having been in DV situations and sexual violence situations myself, and now watching individuals that I love going through these, it has been very hard to navigate. What do boundaries look like? Where do we try to, help? Does it help more or hurt more? And I reached out and said, is there anyone that can talk about this topic in a way that I can do it justice and bring awareness? And Sarah, you were brought forward. We've been kind of Venn diagram in each other's circles for a while, but I think you are the perfect person for this conversation. So I'm going to toss it to you. Tell us a little bit about, who you are, how you got into this area of focus, why it's so important, all of those components.
Now I'm a little intimidated. That was a really nice introduction. So I didn't start here. This was something that I was very, very fearful to be touching as a therapist. I knew that I wanted to do something related to victimization and trauma. So I pursued a specific program that had a trauma focus. And so I knew that's what I wanted to do, but it wasn't until my time spent over at Blackburn Center that I really, really dove into it. I wasn't really even comfortable having conversations about any of this stuff and took on the title of sexual violence therapist. So it was like, so it was really intimidating at the time. And after doing the work with sexual violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence at Blackburn Center, it really just became such a passion for me. I originally was interested in forensic psychology and knew really early on that I needed to be on the survivor victim side. And years later, this is where I'm at, and I love what I do. So
Which may feel weird for people when they hear that, right? To feel like,
yeah.
oh, I love And it makes sense, but it also is contradictory. I love helping people that are in these situations that are so traumatic in many ways and so difficult. And sometimes, I'm sure we'll get into this, they go in paths that, as the therapist, as whoever, you're just like, okay, that's not what hopefully we were aiming for. So it also can be frustrating, but to
Complex. Yes.
yeah, but to have someone, and I guess this is a little bit of a our first tangent, we'll have not a whole bunch of them, but to be a good therapist in this area, you have to have that strange kind of passion and love for it. So, I mean, what are the components of this that really speak to your heart? Is it the support of the people you're working with themselves? Is it watching how things develop? Is it being a part of the long conversation? Because we're in a world where the stigma around this, it's still very there, but it is changing. And I know you're involved in a lot of that advocacy work.
Yeah, so really, really difficult question. Very loaded question. So I think that in trauma in particular, we have to be really, really cautious about causing damage for the people that we potentially work with. So I've always kind of been called to the chaos a little bit. I'm very outspoken about being neurodivergent and having lots of neurospice and being, kind of into a challenge, and I approach the work with populations of individuals who have been victimized in whatever kind of a way, as a real privilege and opportunity for me to lead them in a direction that is going to have them feel fulfilled, not create more damage. And this is really one where the ethics and kind of knowing what you're doing with this population, which I'm pretty sure is why you brought me here, is or part of why you brought me here. It is so crucial in this population because what might seem really well intentioned and out of love can really put people at risk and make people feel really unsafe. So there's a lot of different reasons, and a lot of different, like why I love to do the work that I do, but really I want everybody to live their best lives and be happy. And there is such a significant, like you said about the stigma, like all of these things, it is such a problem. So if I could even just help one person find another option or support one family member, like I don't know, I could go on about why I love this forever. So
Well, I think the first situation that you and I chatted about when we came on, which was, I've got a social work background. I never practiced, but I've been in a lot of situations where there's addiction conversations, and the response is, I won't love you to death and I will cut you off. And if you love the addiction, will go that route, all those pieces. And the very first thing you said is, it's different when it comes to this. And it wasn't one of those like, shame on you for taking that approach when you ran into a situation like this. But I think we don't know what we don't know. And if we're so used to just saying, hey, I'll cut you off, I'll cut off a parent who's toxic, I'll cut off whatever that might be. How is it different in these situations where there's victim violence?
sure. Yeah, absolutely. So it's really, really complicated. And I think in the field, if you don't know, you don't know. So it's not one of those things where you have a loved one who is in an intimate partner violence or domestic violence situation and you just spin a wheel and then they go to get help anywhere. Like and we'll talk about specific resources because even in the field, if you don't seek this out, you are not going to learn how to do this and do this well. So it's really hard to find avenues and opportunities for growth outside of victim service providers, which we'll talk about as resources. Like it's really, really difficult to get the correct guidance for helping individuals with intimate partner violence and domestic.
So the difference when you're the village of support and someone has come to you, you're aware of the history that they have with whatever individual this is they're involved with, and they're continuing, as we know in DV and sexual violence, to go back and go back and go back, and you're just like, all right, I'm done. I'm just going to cut you off. I'm not going to talk to you anymore, because if it is a drug addiction, if it is something of that nature, that is generally how we respond. But in this case, and I think the explanation you gave me made a lot of sense, is about that isolation piece that I know will be a kind of a thread through this, but yeah, a
Yeah.
little more on that.
So thank you for bringing me back. So it does complicate things, and when we have addiction involved in the equation, it's not this kind of straight and narrow, we're not going to enable, we're not going to, you can't do that, because the name of the game with intimate partner violence and domestic violence is isolation. So the more that an individual can learn that their parents aren't great, or maybe even little comments like your mom's annoying, or I don't really care to take the kids over to so and so. These little comments start to build and accumulate, and people tend to steer away from really supportive relationships. So the isolation is going to happen as a natural given. Um, and then you have the addiction aspect of it, where you have to try and find some balance of not adding to the isolation, but also not enabling. So to do that, and I'm not saying that we need therapists to be able to do things like this, but it is a delicate balance that even finding the right people that know what they're doing have to really think and adjust to each individual situation. So how do we not enable and how do we not isolate? And it's going to look different for every individual. But it's challenging. It's really, really tough. And a really great control tactic is the use of drugs and alcohol. So there's a correlation there.
Talk a little bit about that, because this is not just, and I guess it's probably the one stigma that has been broken down a little bit, where it's not that we go seeking abusive relationships in life and then we're just happy in them, but it is something that is slow build over time. Not only just those comments, but the component of, oh, it'll never happen again, or the love bombing that follows, any of those things that create that love is blind kind of conversation, which ironically we are we put this romanticism around it
Oh,
sometimes, but
oh
it's
yeah.
not in any way.
Mm-mm.
So what does that process sometimes look like, from a I met this person, they're amazing, they're great, to you start to see the signs? What are the signs? You start to intervene. You
Yeah.
start to get the pushback. Walk us through that kind of timeline.
Yeah. Well, a conversation that I have with people pretty frequently is, there's like going back to this idea of stigma. It's like, I must be weak, I must be stupid. How did I end up in a relationship like this? All these different things. And a lot of the times, what you will find is people that end up in relationships like this are often really empowered, like really strong individuals. There are certain risk factors that can occur, like going through a vulnerable time in your life can really create an opportunity for somebody to get in that maybe necessarily shouldn't have. We can also come from families where things like this become normalized, or have a sexual abuse history, get out of the household and end up in an intimate partner violence relationship, because there are some similarities with that power and control dynamics. Like, there's a lot of reasons that people end up in relationships like this. And you don't go on a first date and somebody tells you how ugly or disgusting you are, or punches you in the face. They're not going to get a second date. Like, you're not going to do that. So, initially, a lot of the times these relationships start out really passionate, really fiery, really exciting, so many good things. And then what ends up happening is the bad thing happens. So then a cycle starts to occur. So everything's really passionate and really great, and then says a really nasty, mean comment in front of family members or something, and the person gets really embarrassed. And they're like, well, that wasn't really a nice thing to say, but boy, were our first couple dates really lovely. Or after the fight happens or the bad thing happens in the cycle, it is so passionate and so exciting and all of these different things, that it's really, really hard in those moments when the bad things happen to not quickly go to the passion, all the love bombing, like you had said, that we really have a hard time um seeing the negative for what it is, because we go back to how good it was, this idea of how great it was. So we do not know that these people are going to do these things. And in fact, we might find ourselves more susceptible to people like this from our past, or we might seek out individuals with really similar um personality traits or power and control issues.
And I think when you mentioned, it can be the people and not to be cliche, but that you would never expect. The person that always, has something smart to say back when they're out, when you're out with them, or they've got that top-notch job, or they have, I hate to say the perfect Instagram life. We'll probably touch on social media in a minute. But all of those components, and then all of a sudden you just, something slips and you're like, wait, did I just hear what I think I heard? Uh, and I think, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, that when those first few things get said and the people around them have that moment of what happened? Like, what do you mean? And there becomes this unintended judgment moment of just kind of being caught off guard. Like, I didn't expect you to say that. What is the how does that get internalized by the other people, that person who maybe was testing the waters, right? Just to see, was this really strange? Like, is this, do you experience this too? Because, as that the victim or the survivor, however we want to, say them, sometimes that is it's just exploratory at first. And depending on that reaction,
Yep.
I guess that's the first step of that isolation, right?
Yeah. Well, it is, and I also like to go back to your point too about kind of like we know what we know. Things get normalized. Like, I think about doing work with sexual violence, and a lot of it being this complex, long incest situation, which is very, very common. People don't talk about it. It's unbelievably common. But I think about, situations like that where a lot of the times individuals will end up in another power and control issue after they've left the household. They finally made it out of the household because it's so normalized. It's not until they're in different circles or around different people that they're like, wait a minute, this is not this, you not treated like this? So there's even that element there of, you could meet a friend and not know anything about their history. You could be work, friends and not know. And that might be how men treat women in their history. So a lot of it gets normalized. And then in terms of somebody witnessing the slip or whatever it might be, like, I don't even love using that term, but the thing that crosses the line in front of others, is your question about the person in the relationship or a loved one witnessing it? What's your
I
question?
think it's both.
Okay.
So the person who's in the relationship, that's their first potentially, interaction now with their support team or who's been their support team. And when intended or not, the first moment is this judgmental kind of like, what are you talking about? Or I can't believe you let him or you let her. Because it's not gender free, this situation by any means. Yeah. But, so it's that piece. And then from the support person's piece, it's a little bit of like, what do we do next? Like, where do we go from here? How do you even handle that shock value? Or when you go home later in the day and you're like, wait, is that what we were really talking about? Because there's the immediate and then the long term. So yeah.
Hard in the moment because, like sometimes people mess up. Like you have like a couple drinks or something and somebody says something inappropriate or whatever. So, it could be something where it's like, oh, like John must have had a lot to drink or, it's like initially our first response, whether it's sexual violence or intimate partner violence, is social norms. We want to be polite. We want to follow the norms. We want to, so a lot of the times we're chalking things up to maybe they had too much to drink. Maybe it was a mistake. So it's not always easy to know in the moment that it's more than that. I think gut instinct is very important. I think we need to listen to that, what that would ideally look like would be privately talking to your loved one, saying, hey, this didn't seem right. Am I seeing what you saw? Because this didn't sit right with me, and not doing it in front of them because that could create safety issues for them. But it's hard to know in the moment.
Mhm. So more of a, it sounds like, when those things happen, there's no harm in going back and correcting and asking, because assumption can be just as damaging potentially. Or maybe we did hear it wrong. Maybe the whole story didn't really come out and we only got bits and pieces of the conversation when it came down to it. I do, before we get too much further, I realize that we haven't really defined what is intimate partner violence and what is sexual violence. And thinking, that we've got psychological, verbal, physical, emotional, like there's all those things. So, from your experts kind of viewpoint, how you define it as the person kind of navigating those people through the role, what are the things that qualify for those different categories?
It's hard because a lot of the times when people think of intimate partner violence and domestic violence, they're thinking of physical abuse. And being on this side of things and sitting down with a lot of survivors, a lot of the times, I mean, if I had a nickel for every time I've heard, like, oh, I wish I just got beat up. I wish I just had to, which is like bananas to even think that to begin with. But normalized, right? Things get normalized, whatever. So we look at it a lot of what the stereotypical look is of that, which is like hitting and black eyes and different things like that. But what a lot of the time intimate partner violence and domestic violence looks like is somebody having power and control over another individual. And that can look like a lot of different things. Putting people down in front of other people, especially publicly embarrassing them, saying things at the dinner table that is offensive or inappropriate about their partner or somebody else that they love. The isolation piece, it's these little tiny digs of, I don't really, that pushes people further and further away from their loved ones that create this isolation. Sexual coercion is one of them, of, pressuring people to do sexual acts. And this is still, I'm considering this still under the umbrella of intimate partner domestic violence. It's still under that umbrella, but that's a big part of it. Forcing drugs and alcohol. Um, Pets is a big one, like threats to animals, dog, cat, control of children, custody wise, saying bad things about the other parent. I mean, all of these things I think can be normalized as like a toxic relationship and be considered toxic traits. But really, I mean, this is what a lot of intimate partner violence and domestic violence looks like. Yes, all of the other things, hitting, kicking, the outward sexual violence, but a lot of it is the financial abuse, the checking everything that people are doing, leaving the home and leaving just enough gas maybe to get down the street kind of a situation. So there's just so many ways that it's just such a big umbrella, at least for domestic and intimate partner violence, that boils down to the power and control. And sexual violence is the same. It's the power and control is what that boils down to.
And because of that big umbrella, another two-parter question, so I'm glad you have your pen and paper, is is the component of, do the victims even realize they're a victim, and do the abusers realize they're abusers? Because we talk about normalizing, and it's normal to experience certain toxic things for people that have only grown up around that. But I also think, from the other point of view, that if people are internalizing the abuser's perspective, they also may think it's very normal as well if they've not been corrected. So I guess experiences around just kind of how people, like, when the light bulb does or doesn't go off, or does it ever go off on their own, or does it take someone to point it out?
It really depends. Like working in a place like Blackburn Center, it's going to be more upfront because there is a reason that they're either there for some type of victimization, well, of some sort. And so it's like walking through the door, it's either sexual violence or intimate partner violence. When you're doing work, uh, private practice wise, it's different because you're getting people with all different kinds of reasons that they're coming to you. And a lot of the times they're coming to you for something else. And you ask some questions, and you're like, what do you think about that? And a lot of the time it looks like the control stuff. So, they'll say things like, "Yeah, I was giving my partner my phone." I'm like, "Whoa, what? What do you mean? I don't have anything to hide." "Whoa, no, no, no. That's not what we're talking about. It's the fact that the partner is going through your phone." So, a lot of the times the surprise comes in when the conversation is more focused on the control aspect of it, and they're like, "Oh my goodness." So, it can look that way. A thing that also occurs, which is really messed up in its own right, is that a lot of times people come from worse situations. So it's like I've sat down with people who have said, I've always been told that the grass was greener on the other side. And then I went and it wasn't. I'd rather be in a relationship with somebody who is controlling and abusing me than living on my own or having to do shelters or whatever it might be. Sometimes it's like, well, at least he's not raping me. It could be worse. My dad was like this. This guy only hits me. I can handle that. So it really, really, really depends. And then in terms of like, do abusers know that they are abusers? The answer is yes. So I think it can get a little bit blurry whenever we come from families that like abuse and things like that are normalized. Age is going to come into that too, like little kids doing things with little kids and stuff like that. But whenever it comes to adults, something that we discussed a little bit in our pre-meeting that we had was like this idea of narcissistic abuse, which probably will come up at some point in our discussion, is we want to be really, really careful about calling people who are abusers narcissists or whatever it might be, because at the end of the day, abusing people is a choice. It doesn't like, it's like whenever we think about sexual violence and drugs and alcohol does not create behavior. It might maybe make behavior happen more easily or even create an excuse, which we see in intimate partner violence all the time, that it's used. But it absolutely does not create this behavior at all. Abusers know what they're doing. And in fact, you had said too about being able to be kind of schmoozy, being able to appear really well on the outside. That's what these people look like. They're not, it's like sexual violence. You're not driving around in an unmarked white van, with candy. It doesn't look like these are usually handsome, powerful, good-looking individuals. Like, and the more power that you have in the community, the more attractive you are, the more whatever, the more believable you are, and the more likely that the person you are abusing is going to be discredited. Like so that was a long answer, but they're
Oh,
tough.
it was great, and I think that another caveat that I'd love to hear your experience or your awareness on or education on is the flip flop piece of same sex relationships, of men not being the abuser, even though in many cases because of hetero relationships, and simply kind of our size dynamic in many cases, or historically the power of who had the money, who had, those things. But it's changing. So, are we seeing more situations where, because we have legalized, same sex marriage, there's more conversation? Because I can feel like it's not that it's new, it just didn't people weren't maybe seeking the same amount of help for it, or that men who are victims in relationships, how are we navigating that shift? Because that's one that I mean, from my own knowledge of what, my husband's been through in the past with a stalking situation, they don't want to talk about it. They're just, nope.
Or
It'll go away if I ignore it long enough, or I just keep my mouth shut.
yeah, and you know what? I'll write a note to go back to stalking because that's a whole thing that's really hard to get sometimes law enforcement to, take seriously. And a lot of these things, I mean, not to go off on that tangent, but domestic calls are not calls that law enforcement a lot of the times are pumped to take. And a lot of the times they're getting repeat calls for the same household, and people end up leaving with harassment charges on both sides of things when one, so the whole legal side is another meeting in itself. So we'll go back to the stalking. In terms of like the same sex domestic intimate partner violence. Is there any like specific questions that you have about that? Like in particular, like
I
why
think just bringing the component of this isn't only just men versus women in marriages or even romantic relationships. You can see this in I hate to say there's whole ID network shows on friends being violent against each other and ultimately leading to some really horrific stuff. So it's, I guess, beyond just kind of where our mind instantly goes from a stereotypical standpoint. Where else do these intimate partner and different types of kind of abusive relationships, where can we see them?
everywhere. Um, and if you view it as a power and control dynamic, which is what it is, and it's the same thing for sexual violence, it is everywhere in every relationship demographic, essentially. You're going to have moments where certain things are going to be cared about more than others, Black and brown people are going to have issues with, they're not going to get the same treatment maybe that myself or you, for example, of being lighter skinned people or white individuals are going to get. They're going to have different outcomes with the police. They're going to have different, like rates for abuse are going to look differently for Black and brown individuals. LGBTQ plus community are at higher risk. It's going to be across the board, but power and control dynamics are going to be in every single oppressed group, just like they are in the mainstream. So, yep, all power and control. Even with sexual violence, too, I just want to add is with that being said, people will say, well, they only abuse like females, or my son's fine around them. It does not matter. It is about power and control. It doesn't matter if you're a 6-year-old boy or a 15-year-old, teenager or a 3-year-old or something like that. Like it is a power and control thing. It's not about seeking out a specific, type of, so not to scare people, but
Yeah. Well, and we've mentioned and sprinkled in a few of the risk factors, that come in. So just if you've grown up in a situation like that, now we've touched on if you're part of a marginalized or oppressed community, there may be a higher risk that you're facing again to find yourself in one of these kind of dynamics. What are some of the other risk factors that people who kind of fall into those groups may be more likely to and even more so, I mean, I'm even thinking about the ability to get out of a relationship, the resources, the financial piece you talk about, so there's the risk of actually finding yourself in a relationship or a situation with that dynamic. And then there's the added risk of being able to actually end that relationship and, get onto a new timeline, a new path that doesn't then repeat again.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the hardest things sitting down with somebody who's been trying to leave a relationship for a long period of time, because by the time, especially working at a place like Blackburn Center, by the time they've made it to you, most people in their family that love and care about them are over it. I'm done. I'm not dealing with this. They're a burden. They're a pain in the butt. Why won't you just dot 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 whatever, like all of that mentality. So it's really really hard because no one wants to to deal with them anymore. So you get further isolated in that aspect. The things that really put people at risk, how you were raised, the family of origin that you came from, what's normalized and not normalized, vulnerable moments in life, which we all have, where maybe we are more able or willing to or more susceptible to bring in certain relationships that maybe we wouldn't at other points in our lives. As you mentioned, the financial piece is massive. Like there's so much, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just whatever? Leaving takes money, leaving takes resources, leaving takes planning. You don't just go and get a PFA. I mean, a PFA at the end of the day can be helpful, but is really a piece of paper. And sometimes going to get a PFA puts people at higher risk for violence than it does to not. So it is so complicated. There's a million good reasons to stay, and nobody just picks up and leaves because if they did, we wouldn't be here right now. We wouldn't be having this conversation. So ask me more because I'm just going on a tangent.
Well, let's go back to the stalking piece because I do think as we're talking about the ability to leave, there's a component that in some cases go, even if I leave, I'm not free. I'm not away. As you mentioned, a PFA is a piece of paper. How many times have we heard that they're not enforced, or by the time you call, it's the last on the list of the responses? So what that and that is a it's not violent outwardly. It is violence psychologically in many ways and often can lead to something beyond that. But stalking as a kind of precursor or a like consequence that folks are afraid of because it can happen on both ends, right? Ahead of time, during, after,
Yeah.
tracking your phone, all of those pieces.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because that's one of the things that comes up a good bit is like apps, tracking apps, things like that, air tags, other things that are similar to that. Like, we have better ability to be able to find things like that now. But there are a lot of apps and things on the phone that people can know exactly where you are at all times. There are apps that are designed for parents to be used for kids that adults are using to follow and track and keep tabs on their partners or people that aren't their partners. The thing that's really challenging, I think, with the stalking too, is like you said, that it's such a psychological element to that. And what all survivors, victims have in common is somebody is taking power from them. And there's nothing more, disempowering than not being able to do anything about someone following you around and doing. I mean, it's very hard to prove. There's no violence happening. I mean, if they're not on your property, it's very much like sexual violence and intimate partner violence all under this umbrella, really, really hard crimes to prove. And you have a lot of the times the recommendation looks like keeping harassment logs. And that is time consuming. And if you even get to a courtroom, who knows if anyone's even going to care or take a look. It can be really, really create a hopeless feeling for people. Like, what do you do?
And if there hasn't been a threat of violence, and this is what we learned firsthand, and Josh knows I'm talking about this situation. He actually agreed to do an episode on it at some point. But on our first date, an air tag popped when I got into his car. And it was someone that he had, an on again, off again thing with. And she had put an air tag on his car, tracked him the whole way into Pittsburgh. He found it on the ride home because I thought it was a briefcase. Like, I was just like, oh, someone's got something in the car. Like, you don't even like register. And, called her out on it. She admitted to it. He went to the police. They said, there's nothing we can do. We can call her and tell her to leave you alone. So again, whatever dynamic that was with a girl and a guy kind of thing. And, and up until that point, he admits, he goes, I joke that she seemed to be everywhere I was. Like, oh, she must be following me. And he goes, now I realized she was. And he never let on, but you could tell he was rattled. And he ended up, we've mentioned Blackburn Center for those in southwestern Pennsylvania. Sarah, I'll have you mention kind of what that center is. But, Alice Paul House is what we have here in Indiana, PA. And that's the only place that knew what to do for anything to say, yes, you can get a PFA. But when we went to court, they were blunt. They said, well, she's never threatened to hurt you or kill you. You will not get a PFA. We can get a civil no contact order, which is what we did. But it was like, are you kidding? Like,
You can have stacks of harassment logs, and it doesn't go, yeah, it's
and so in
bananas.
that case, I can tell where helplessness comes in. So if you are someone and you were like, oh my God, I finally have enough. I'm going to get out of this. There's
Yeah,
clearly someone's, doing this to me. And then the system, which is very broken in so many ways, goes, just kidding. So, well, I'll fall back onto what's comfortable then. And I don't want to burden people around me with this.
for sure. Yep. Or, we go back to the idea of stigma. A lot of the times people will get into a new relationship, and at least an orange flag, I'll say, is when somebody's like, "Oh man, my ex, they were crazy. They were just whatever." And then, yeah, okay, maybe that's true. But what ends up happening, and I've said this many times, is that they were crazy until you were. And then the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. And a lot of the times, I'm not saying that we need to be amicable or friends with exes and things like that, but that's more of a green flag than, they were crazy and this, that, and the other. So there can be a lot of stigma with for the individual in a relationship like this, that they don't want people to know. They don't. It can be embarrassing. Like, so there's a lot of, there's the legal system part of it is one of the most challenging aspects of it. And what things end up looking like, at least on my end, and even of family and support systems, is safety planning. A lot of the times it's playing the long game. One of the most dangerous parts of a relationship, it can be whenever people are leaving. So, what your gut instinct might be to say, "Oh, well, why don't you just call the police and get a PFA, or why don't you just A, B, and C?" It might be safer for that individual to stay for a few more months, which sounds insane, and really make a plan and take whatever terrible things are happening to them and maybe their family, in order to make a really good, solid plan to get the heck out of there.
So the two dynamics that I want to tease out on that a little bit, which is as the loved one, I think at least for me and my mindset, it's always been tempting to say, okay, well, we'll start you a savings account for when you're ready, but you only get access to it if I
Oh,
believe you should have access. And like, what a power, right? You're going from one power shift to the other
yeah,
because how can
bingo.
I trust you that you've ended up in this situation and now I'm going to do the same thing for you? And so it's how much of an improvement is it really when it comes down to that piece? And then I think the other one in there being, we're talking about safety planning, but and I don't know the stat. I don't know if I don't want to put you on the spot for it, but the likelihood of mortality in these situations versus long term, I almost want to say disability, depression, like inability to cope and comfort, like that harm is not always, I end up, to be quite frank, dead. It may be a loss of self or other pieces. So first one was the one power to the other power, and how do we safety plan? And then the second piece being, well, what does safety look like? Because it's not cookie cutter.
No, these are really good. And it never is. It's never cookie cutter. It can't be, because what works for you isn't going to work for me, and vice versa. Every situation's different. You hit the nail on the head about the power dynamics. Like, I've even sat with this, like, some of the worst has to do with kids in custody, in divorce, like that, and pets. Like, pets are one of the biggest reasons uh, that a lot of people have difficulty leaving, because they don't have, they're afraid the animal's going to get hurt, and they don't have anywhere to put the animal. Um, so they're so used to having control being placed upon them, that family members will say, "I'm taking you out of my will. You're not getting the inheritance. We won't be, doing A, B, and C. We're not going to be getting things for Johnny and Sally for Christmas. Like, we're not." And all that does is further isolate and disempower a disempowered individual. Like, we do not want to be making choices for them. Do you have to be smart about things? Yeah, sure. And then you add drugs and alcohol, like you said with the bank account, makes things really tricky. So it's a really hard thing. There's no kind of right or wrong answer, but the last thing we want to do is take more power away. It's going to push them further away. We want to be available. We want to be there in case they call. So it's like trying to be as non-judgmental as you possibly can. And it's so hard when it's an adult and it's somebody that you love, because you want to, you want the worst for the bad guy, or the person who's doing the thing. And it doesn't always look like that. Sometimes these people can have really good parenting moments and be really good at, A, B, and C, and the kids would be devastated if the family, it's just so complex. but we want to make ourselves available, be non-judgmental, because if they have a moment where they feel like they're ready and they need help planning, we want them to call. And if you're making threats about taking them out of your will or whatever it might be, they're going to go towards the abuser. You're not helping. So that's one thing. One of the things that you brought up that I wanted to touch on too is this like long-term lasting effect after a relationship like this. So one of my favorite pieces of clinical work to do, which I don't get to do enough of, I wish that I got to do more of this, is when people get out of a bad relationship and then get into a good one. And it's so much fun to like teach them what new norms are and like, oh, this is boring. No, it's not boring. It's not, it's because it's not going up and down all of the time. This relationship isn't boring. It's consistent. It's predictable. It's stable, that kind of a thing. But one of the things that's really challenging is that even after we end a relationship like this, let's say I've had this happen, let's say that the perpetrator is actually in jail, which is not usually the norm, but let's say that they are. And we know that we are safe and we can do life and whatever, our bodies still get really stuck. Like we still have a hard time being able to trust. We might need therapy. We might need things like EMDR to help heal from some of these things that even though our rational brain knows that we are safe, our limbic system, our body is still trying to keep us safe. So that can create a lot of issues in healthy relationships, for example, because all of these really heavy, toxic things have really been normalized. And we need to remember that even though they're safe, they might still be doing things that don't make sense because their body is not caught up yet. So, wanted to bring that up. And then you talk about safety planning. So, safety planning is a huge spectrum. So safety planning can look like this one's going to sound really wild, but safety planning can look like not locking yourself in a bathroom. I know that sounds crazy, but there's a lot of hard surfaces in a bathroom. So if you know that this individual is physically violent, the last place that you want to hide is in a place with a porcelain tub and a porcelain, sink and things like that. So safety planning can be as, I don't know the word, like as upfront as that. Safety planning can also look like checking your phone for different apps, looking at things on, so it is this whole giant spectrum and it is done at all different levels of a relationship that can look like minimizing lethality, like hiding in a closet instead of hiding in a bathroom, or doing some of these maintenance things like checking apps on a phone, or um, only doing planning at the library, or getting on a VPN, or different things like that. Getting birth certificates, social security cards, putting them in a lockbox, giving them to a family member, maybe having someone open up a bank account so that you can send some cash over. It really, really looks different for every stage and every individual, but it can range from as much as, the same thing with the kitchen. There's a lot of things that we could get hurt with in the kitchen. You go into a bedroom, it's going to minimize traumatic brain injuries, things like that that can be really, really lethal.
And those are the things I think we don't think about, and even as you're talking about, like, being in the kitchen, even someone defending themselves, the lethality increases if for defense, I can take a knife, and then you end up with a victim who's under scrutiny for injuring an abuser, which we've seen time and time again, in the news, so those pieces definitely, kind of resonate from that perspective.
Want to add something? It's that if we're talking about trying to, be able to recognize it a little bit more and kind of get a little bit better of an understanding of it, one of the things that we did not mention, which I don't, we probably don't have time for, but is strangulation
Mhm.
and
Oh,
lethality.
let's let's touch on that, because if someone here is wondering, do I need to seek help now, or am I in that early safety planning of, hey, I just need to start having a conversation? There are different urgencies to which support you get. So let's touch on the strangulation piece, and then let's get into kind of what are my urgent available resources, and what are some of the ones that I can ease into, take some time with, because there's a difference in the velocity of how you're moving through this kind of severity situation.
And you're so right with that, and that's why in the resource conversation, it's so important to be going places that this is not new to them, because it needs to be assessed ongoing, like constantly. So it's not something where you can just kind of drop the ball on it. Like, we need to be assessing at all times of what is the best choice, because what the best choice this week might not be the best choice next week. And you have to really see what's going on in the moment to make a good decision. So yes, we will totally go back to that. But the strangulation part, I just wanted to bring up, and you're very, like, you're spot on about the urgency part of that, is that what we know about strangulation is that it is a massive, massive predictor of lethality. So if you are somebody who is surviving, let's say, like the first attempt of a strangulation within a relationship, it's your chances of death by homicide by your partner go up by 750%. So it's an urgent matter. And it's one of those things where things can kind of get blurry, especially when we talk about certain behaviors and relationship dynamics being normalized. So where I'm going with this is in the bedroom, right? With with sex. So, there's that is where a lot of issues can come into play with this. And people tend to have some of these toxic things normalized, that, like, I guess it comes down to consent at the end of the day. There's no amount of strangulation to hurt somebody, especially, or even for sex, that we know to be safe. Period. Like, you're not a medical doctor, and even if you were a medical doctor, there's no stopping point of saying, oh, nope, we need to just, like, tone this down a little bit. So the even on the sexual end of things, it does not matter. The lethality when it comes to intimate partner violence and strangulation, if you know somebody, if you hear somebody who's saying things like that, that is a urgent issue where they need to get set up with somebody, just to have some type of availability of resources. In fact, in our state, we have a lethality assessment that police officers are supposed to be doing on domestic violence calls, and the whole purpose of that is to assess for lethality. Strangulation is on that, and get them connected to a victim service provider because of the increased rate of lethality. So it's super serious. It's always a red flag. It's not an orange flag. It's not a yellow flag. It's a red flag. And yes, there are some things that happen in the bedroom that, involve some things like that, but the difference is consent. The different, like, there's a whole different thing. And these are all, even if there are power and control dynamics happening in a healthy kind of sexual way, there's always consent. That's the difference. There's rules, there's boundaries. A lot of things go into um, these kind of behaviors in the bedroom that are all dictated by respect and consent. So it's very different. I'm being tangential, but
No, so let's say
every
someone's listening, their ears are perking up, maybe they're sending this to someone that they love, and they're like, hey, just skip to time marker 50. I just want you to hear this thing, and they need kind of to know, where do I go today? And I guess from a national perspective, from you're in a small town, maybe you don't have I hate to say even a police department that can respond quickly or anything like that. What do the different kind of urgent resources look like? And then, back to what are some of the long build or more sustainable support that folks can look into?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, always, always, you can always contact domestic violence hotline. Like, you just put that in, you can do a national hotline. I really like finding local providers though. The reason for that is that every county is different. Um, the way that things are done look differently. The legal system is different, even from, Westmoreland County to Allegheny County outside of the Pittsburgh area. Going to your local, so each county will have one. Like you said, Alice Paul's out in Indiana. I think they might even serve more than one county. It doesn't even matter if you are going to the county that you do not live in. They will take you, it's like a little bit stepping on toes a bit, but no one cares at the end of the day because it is serious and we need to help people. So every single county is going to have one. Like in this area, I've mentioned Blackburn Center, Pittsburgh, Center for Victims, Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. But if you literally put it into Google, domestic violence hotline, and you call that number and you say where you are located, they will find you your nearest domestic violence or victim service provider place. And the reason I say that is that places that are treating intimate partner violence and domestic violence are also treating sexual violence and victimization across the board. So you're going to be, you're going to be able to find help under that umbrella. So that's definitely, I would say, the place to start. What's really lovely about places like that, at least I can only speak to our state, is that these services are at no cost. So free therapy. And this is free therapy for any survivors of victimization, but also for family members. So if your sister is in a domestic violence relationship, you would be eligible to receive services to help work through your own things, maybe learn about safety planning, get educated about the legal system in your county at no cost. That's the same for kids, everything like that. So you or a loved one would meet criteria for that, to be able to do that. And a lot of the times they have legal services where you can get free legal counsel from attorneys that work in-house. They have legal advocates that hang out at the courthouse and help you fill out PFA paperwork. They attend court hearings. It is such a valuable resource that people don't know about.
And I think I hate to say the more that we utilize services like that when necessary, hopefully the more that they can continue to grow and build. Because I'm thinking, hey, if you are a Black brown person in nowhere land, Pennsylvania, there may not be someone at that county that understands maybe some of the dynamics of your situation, or in a same sex relationship, or any of those, or speaking a different language. If you're non-English speaking. But this is where I hate to say, as those surrounding people we love, we can advocate for funding for those services. We can advocate for what those needs are. And then those can be a part of some of the things we probably look for in that longer term support piece. So let me get to that contracting for safety in this moment, and then find that right match for the right support, for the right path that I need to go down as I go into the future. So those longer term pieces, there's victims, funding, I think you had mentioned, available in at
Uh,
least Pennsylvania,
yeah,
but probably, I'm guessing, in other states as well. But a
every
little bit
state.
of that piece.
Mhm.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so every single state in the United States has it. It's the Victim Compensation Assistance Program, and we call it VCAP. We have a really nice VCAP in our state in Pennsylvania. And basically there's a sexual assault specific one, which is really, really fantastic. In our state, you don't need to report for sexual abuse to be eligible for those funds. And it's basically a form which I will submit for you to share. And you fill out the form, you send it in. You don't need to say who the perpetrator was. You can provide as much information as you'd like. And that goes towards any out-of-pocket therapy costs, whether it's copays, or maybe you want to see a provider that maybe you have Medicaid insurance and you're having a hard time finding a provider that focuses on this. You're able to see anybody because of that. And then there's also VCAP for other types of victimization that's not just sexual violence. That one's a little bit more complicated. But all of these victim service providers, they have people that are trained to help you fill out these forms. So it's lovely. And the money that's put into this, bucket essentially is funded by people who break the law. So use it.
Yeah, and I think it's funny, if you can hear the siren in the background. I was like, the siren was coming out to tell us it's time to hear and to know where we go with some of this, because there is a component of urgency. I think that the world of social media has isolated us just a society more, and created more opportunities. Technology, as we mentioned, from the tracking apps to all these things. We're in this changing dynamic piece where there's a lot of extra help, but there's also a lot of extra harm that can come as associated with it. Sarah, I know we're gonna come back. We're gonna have part two of the conversation, that I think, and I guess it's the message that I'll leave on, and then I want to hear kind of your closing thoughts on this piece of the conversation, which is no matter any of this, whether you are the victim or you are the supporting person, and you're listening and you're like, oh, I could have done something better, or I could have sought help earlier. Guilt and shame are power components of this control conversation, and not just for the victim, but for all that are around of I didn't do enough, or I didn't get involved, or, I did isolate that person. And so, not leaving this conversation with that feeling. The goal of today was awareness and education. Did you know some of the nuggets that were shared about, what are indicators, what are lethality components, what are resources that are available, and to sit on that and digest it a little bit. And when we come back around and we talk about some of this, because I know as the family loved one or whoever it might be, that guilt and shame is the push and pull. It's like one day I'm like, I don't care. And the next day I'm like, oh my God, I've sucked, there's abandoned everything. And then you're back to, the boy who cried wolf and all. And that just dynamic that battles within us. So that's kind of my note to folks that are listening is please walk away from this with where can you find more information, hearing about how complex this truly is. This isn't in your mind. If you're just kind of like, oh my God, that's so much. It is this complex. And hopefully looking to maybe educate yourself a little further or those around you, and then come back for the second part where we'll go a little bit further. But Sarah, what are your kind of closing thoughts on today's initial chat of this really hard to talk about topic that likes to live in the shadows and likes to live in darkness, that when we bring to light, I think makes us all question a little bit about who we've been, what we're doing, and all those pieces.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really important to have these conversations. I think that we need to make these conversations easy. We need to be talking about this. It is such a normalized thing that comes with such a stigma that you know somebody who is in an intimate partner violence or domestic violence relationship. You know somebody who has some type of sexual assault history if it's not yourself. 1 in 4 for females by 18, 1 in 6 for males by 18 for sexual assault. Everybody is affected by this. So let's make it easy to talk about. So that's the first thing. With your guilt and shame comment, love that because it is. It's so powerful, and in a very not positive way. That we don't want to guilt and shame ourselves. We also don't want to guilt and shame our loved ones. That is not going to get them to leave the relationship. You think they already don't know how bad it is, right? Like that's their life, right? So what about your kids or what about they've already thought about that. So don't guilt them. And then yourself, if you don't know, you don't know. And if you're in the field and you don't specialize, you don't know. So if that makes you feel better, like take that for a little, put that feather in your cap. But guilt, let's leave that at the door. And then the other thing is too, just to kind of normalize not knowing what the heck to do with this, is that domestic violence doesn't play by the rules. That's why couples counseling doesn't work for a lot of different reasons. Because it's not about couples counseling. It's not about working on a relationship. Whenever everybody's on this level playing field and we're doing the normal thing, expecting the normal outcome, then things might change, right? It doesn't play by the rules. It doesn't work that way. So what you think might work for your mom and dad or this family member or a friend that you know or your own marriage or whatever, that is not a power and control dynamic, it's not going to work for one that is. So your thinking might be a little bit too not toxic to help this toxic situation. So if you don't know, you don't know. And I hope that this gives some people an opportunity to just start talking about it like what you ate for lunch yesterday, because it's that common.
And that's how we get societal change is by being able to not stop talking about it. And we can touch on that next time around. So if this conversation has resonated with you, like I mentioned, share it with someone that it can create a difference in their life, or simply internalize it a little bit yourself. And as Sarah said, you probably know someone in this situation and you don't even realize it. So listening out for those moments, having just kind of that, as we talked in the very beginning, that follow up of, oh, maybe I do want to check on them. Maybe I do want to call, and just having that open opportunity to be there, as you've heard mentioned a few times. So thank you everyone for hanging in there, listening to this kind of heavy conversation, but it is one that is filled with so much information that we definitely still are just touching the tip of the iceberg on. Way more there. Sarah, thank you so much for your time and expertise. Come in here, check the show notes for those resources and those links if you need them or someone you know or loves needs that information, and come back around probably next week for part 2 of the conversation that we will get into, that will wrap up the piece of how can you support and look out for yourself in the same aspect, because we're all dealing with our own burdens that we carry, and we can't be everyone's savior, but we definitely can be a part of the solutions that lie ahead for us.
Bingo.
So thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.